Jack Malone had always dreamed of owning a home with a garage big enough to house his growing collection of vintage cars. For years, he had worked tirelessly as an auto mechanic, saving every penny he could to turn that dream into reality. When he finally found the perfect property, a spacious house on the outskirts of town with a massive detached garage, it felt like fate. The previous owner, an older man who had shared Jack's love for classic cars, had meticulously maintained the garage, outfitting it with a reinforced roof, sturdy workbenches, and enough space to store several vehicles. It wasn't just a place to park his cars, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could shut the world out and lose himself in the hum of an engine, the scent of motor oil, and the satisfaction of bringing old machines back to life. Moving in had been a whirlwind of excitement and exhaustion. Jack spent weeks setting up his workshop, organizing his tools, and carefully transporting his prized possessions, rare automotive parts, collector's items, and of course his cars. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost too quiet, but that was exactly what he wanted. After years of dealing with noise, chaos, and entitled customers in his repair shop, he was looking forward to some well-earned peace. The few neighbors he had met seemed pleasant enough, offering polite nods and the occasional wave as he unloaded his belongings. There was, however, one exception. From the moment he arrived, Karen Brooks had made her presence known. She was in her late 50s, with overly styled blonde hair and an air of self-importance that seemed to cling to her like cheap perfume. She wasted no time in marching up to Jack's driveway on his very first afternoon in the neighborhood, her arms crossed and an artificial smile plastered across her heavily made-up face. "You must be the new owner," she said, her tone bordering on condescending. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Karen. I've lived here for 20 years, so I know everything there is to know about this place." Jack, still covered in dust and sweat from unloading heavy toolboxes, wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Karen." Her gaze drifted past him, settling on the garage with an almost predatory interest. "Oh, that place," she mused. "You know, I always wanted that garage. My husband and I tried to buy this property years ago, but the old owner wouldn't sell. Such a shame, really. It would have been perfect for me." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Well, I guess it worked out for me then." Karen let out a small, forced laugh. "I suppose so. But I hope you'll be a good neighbor and keep it well maintained. This is a nice neighborhood, and we all take pride in our homes." Jack could already tell she was the type who thrived on control. He had dealt with people like her before, nosy, overbearing, and convinced they had authority over things that didn't belong to them. He gave a non-committal nod, hoping she would take the hint and leave, but Karen wasn't done. "You know," she continued, stepping closer, "the old owner used to let me store a few things in there. Just some garden tools and seasonal decorations. It was kind of an unspoken agreement." Jack frowned. "Well, it's my space now, so I'll be keeping it for myself." Her smile flickered for a moment before she regained her composure. Of course. I just thought I'd mention it. You know, for history's sake." Jack wasn't buying it. Something about the way she looked at his garage, the way she lingered as if she was already mentally rearranging the space to suit her needs, sent a wave of irritation through him. He had worked too hard for this place to let someone like her worm her way in. The weeks that followed only reinforced his initial impression of Karen. She had a habit of accidentally wandering onto his property, commenting on his work, and offering unsolicited advice on how he should improve the garage. More than once, he caught her peering through the side windows, as if taking inventory of what was inside. Each time he confronted her, she would laugh it off, claiming she was just admiring the craftsmanship or reminiscing about the good old days. Jack started locking the garage at all times, even when he was inside. He installed a new security system, complete with motion-activated floodlights and cameras. He wasn't paranoid by nature, but something about Karen set off every alarm in his gut. She acted as if the garage had always been hers, as if Jack was merely an intruder occupying what she believed to be rightfully hers. Then came the night everything changed. It was just after midnight when Jack was jolted awake by a loud crash. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, the remnants of a dream bleeding into reality. But then he heard it again, a deep, metallic groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. His heart pounded as he threw back the covers and rushed to the window, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight below. The garage roof had partially collapsed. A gaping hole yawned in the center, exposing the dark interior. Pieces of wood and metal littered the driveway, some of them still shifting as the structure settled. But what sent a chill down Jack's spine wasn't the damage itself, it was the figure standing in the middle of the wreckage. Karen. She was dressed in a silk robe and slippers, her hands gripping a flashlight. The beam danced erratically over the debris as she surveyed the destruction, her expression eerily calm, almost pleased. Jack stormed outside, his bare feet barely registering the cold pavement. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen turned slowly, her face a picture of feigned innocence. "Oh, Jack, I was just walking by when I heard the noise. Terrible, isn't it?" He clenched his jaw, barely resisting the urge to grab her and drag her away from his property. "What did you do?" Karen gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Me? Oh, Jack, how could you think such a thing? This looks like an unfortunate accident. That garage was old, wasn't it? Maybe it was bound to fall apart eventually." Jack's fists tightened at his sides. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but deep down, he knew she would never admit to anything. Then he noticed something. Among the wreckage, half buried under the collapsed beams, was a large plastic storage container, the kind he used to store his tools. The lid was partially pried open, and inside he could see several items that weren't supposed to be there. His missing wrenches, his socket set, the limited edition car manual he had spent years hunting down. Jack's blood turned to ice. Karen had been stealing from him. And now, with the garage destroyed, she probably thought she could take whatever she wanted, acting as if it was hers all along. But she had underestimated him. Jack wasn't about to let this go, and Karen was about to find out just how big of a mistake she had made. Jack stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the wreckage of his garage, his heart hammering in his chest. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, and with it came a slow-burning, ice-cold rage. His sanctuary, the one place he had poured his time, money, and effort into, was now a disaster zone. The damage was extensive. The gaping hole in the roof had caused one of the support beams to collapse, which in turn had crushed a row of shelves containing tools, car parts, and rare memorabilia. Pieces of shattered wood and twisted metal were scattered across the floor, the remains of what had once been a perfectly organized workspace. And standing in the middle of it all was Karen, her expression disturbingly calm, as if she had simply stumbled upon an unfortunate accident rather than the destruction she had likely caused. Jack took a slow, measured breath, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He knew if he allowed his anger to take control, this situation could escalate into something far worse than just a ruined garage. But when he looked at Karen, at the satisfied glint in her eyes and the way she held herself with an air of quiet triumph, he had to fight the overwhelming urge to grab her and demand answers. Instead, he forced his voice to stay level, though the edge of fury in his tone was impossible to hide. "What the hell happened here?" Karen blinked, tilting her head slightly, as if she were genuinely puzzled by the question. "Oh, Jack, I was just taking my usual evening walk when I heard a terrible noise. I rushed over to check," and she gestured dramatically to the collapsed structure. "Well, this is what I found." Jack's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that? That you just happened to be here, in the middle of the night, right as my garage collapsed?" She placed a hand on her chest, feigning shock. "Jack, you sound like you're accusing me of something. I was just trying to be a good neighbor." He wasn't buying it. Not for a second. Everything about this felt off. Karen had been circling his garage like a vulture ever since he moved in, and now, conveniently, it had fallen apart right in front of her. And then there was the storage container half buried under the debris, filled with items that had gone missing weeks ago. That alone told him everything he needed to know. But he also knew that simply accusing her wasn't going to get him anywhere. If she had the audacity to destroy his property, she wouldn't hesitate to lie through her teeth to cover her tracks. He needed proof. Jack took another deep breath and forced himself to step back, to regain control. This wasn't the time to act impulsively. He needed to assess the damage and figure out his next move. Without another word, he turned away from Karen and stepped into the wreckage, carefully navigating the shattered remains of his workspace. The moment he got closer to the storage container, Karen shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering with something that almost resembled panic before she quickly masked it. Jack crouched down and lifted the lid, his stomach twisting as he took in the sight of his stolen tools. His wrenches, socket set, and even the expensive precision screwdrivers he had been searching for were neatly stacked inside, as if they had been packed away for safekeeping. And there, sitting on top of the pile, was the limited edition car manual he had spent years tracking down. It was still in pristine condition, but he knew for a fact that he had left it locked inside his garage cabinet. He slowly turned his head toward Karen, and for the first time since this nightmare started, he saw a crack in her carefully crafted mask. It was subtle, a flicker of unease that passed over her features before she plastered on another artificial smile. "Oh, that's interesting," she said lightly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I wonder how those got in there." Jack straightened, his eyes never leaving her face. "That's what I'd like to know." Karen let out a small, nervous laugh. "Well, maybe they just—" He cut her off. "You need to leave." She blinked. "Excuse me." Jack took a step toward her, his patience hanging by a thread. "I said, get off my property right now." Karen hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to argue, but then she let out an exaggerated sigh and shook her head. "Fine, fine. I was only trying to help, but if this is how you're going to treat me." She trailed off, then turned on her heel and started walking back toward her house, her pace slow, deliberate, as if she wanted to make sure he knew that she was leaving on her own terms. Just before she stepped onto her porch, she glanced over her shoulder and said, "You really should be more careful, Jack. That garage was falling apart. It's a good thing no one got hurt." And with that, she disappeared inside. Jack stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He had no proof that she had been the one to sabotage his garage, but every fiber of his being told him she was responsible. The problem was, what could he do about it? The police wouldn't take his word over hers, and without concrete evidence, he couldn't exactly accuse her of breaking and entering, let alone theft or vandalism. But he also knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. By morning, Jack had a plan. He called his insurance company to report the damage, knowing that at the very least, he needed to start the process of assessing the cost of repairs. Then he made a list of everything that had been stolen and recovered, carefully documenting each item with photos and timestamps. He wasn't going to let this slide. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. But just as he was beginning to feel like he had a handle on the situation, something happened that sent a new wave of unease coursing through him. That afternoon, he heard the unmistakable sound of laughter coming from Karen's backyard. Curious, he stepped onto his porch and peered over the fence. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, sitting on Karen's patio table, was one of his engine components, a rare part he had been meaning to install in one of his restoration projects. And next to it, stacked neatly in a pile, were several more of his missing tools. Karen was hosting a small gathering, chatting and laughing with a few other neighbors, as if she hadn't just been caught standing in the middle of a destroyed garage the night before. But what struck him the most was the way she occasionally glanced toward his house, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She wasn't just stealing from him. She was taunting him. Jack clenched his fists. He had played it carefully before, but now he knew one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt: Karen wasn't going to stop until he made her. And this time he wasn't going to wait for her next move. He was going to be ready. Jack had dealt with difficult people before. Over the years, he had encountered his fair share of entitled customers, unreasonable bosses, and the occasional neighborhood busybody who thought they had a say in how he lived his life. But Karen was different. She didn't just push boundaries, she ignored them entirely, acting as if they had never existed in the first place. And now, after the destruction of his garage and the unsettling discovery that she had been stealing from him all along, he knew that this wasn't just some petty neighborhood squabble. This was personal. She wasn't just trying to inconvenience him, she wanted him gone. The next morning, Jack took a deep breath, sat down with a cup of coffee, and laid out his next steps. He knew there was no quick fix to this situation, no easy way to prove Karen's involvement, but he wasn't about to let her get away with this either. He started by calling his insurance company again, pressing for an immediate on-site evaluation of the damage. When the adjuster arrived later that afternoon, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and an expression that suggested he had seen just about everything, Jack walked him through the wreckage. "Looks like structural failure," the man muttered as he took photos, kneeling to examine the broken beams. "But it's weird. Usually this kind of collapse happens due to long-term deterioration or poor construction. Any history of termite damage?" Jack shook his head. "None. I had the place inspected when I moved in. No rot, no pests, nothing like that. The structure was solid." The adjuster frowned, reaching out to touch one of the snapped beams. His fingers brushed against the splintered wood, and he let out a low whistle. This wasn't just wear and tear. See these marks? It looks like someone deliberately weakened the supports, probably with a saw. Jack's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent another wave of anger through him. "You sure?" "Nothing's ever 100%, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and this doesn't look natural. If I had to guess, I'd say someone cut into these beams, just enough to make it seem like an accident but weak enough to give out under the right conditions." Jack exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. He had no doubt who was responsible, but proving it was another matter. The adjuster took more photos, made some notes on his tablet, and told Jack that while the insurance company would cover some of the repairs, they'd need a formal investigation before accusing anyone of foul play. That was fine. Jack wasn't about to sit around waiting for paperwork. He had his own way of handling things. That night he stayed up late, sitting on his porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the quiet street. Karen's house was dark, but he knew better than to assume she was asleep. The woman had a way of moving like a shadow, slipping in and out of sight when it suited her. He had seen the smirk on her face earlier that day, had watched her laugh with the neighbors while his stolen tools sat in plain view on her patio. She wasn't just confident, she was daring him to do something about it. At around 2 in the morning, movement caught his eye. A figure, barely visible in the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, was standing near the side of his property. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw the faint shift of fabric, the subtle tilt of a head. Someone was watching his house. Jack didn't move. He remained seated, his grip tightening around the neck of his beer bottle. Whoever it was, they were testing him, waiting to see if he would react. He didn't. Instead, he leaned back, took a slow sip, and casually reached for his phone. He had already installed new security cameras after the garage collapse, and his phone was connected to the live feed. With a quick swipe, he pulled up the footage from the camera positioned along the side of his house. The grainy black and white image confirmed what he already knew: someone was standing just beyond the fence, partially obscured by the trees. They weren't moving, weren't making a sound, just watching. Jack switched to the next camera, one positioned at a slightly different angle, and when the screen refreshed, his stomach twisted. Karen. She was standing just outside his property line, her hands tucked into the pockets of her robe, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were studying something interesting. Jack lowered the phone and exhaled through his nose. If she thought she was going to intimidate him, she was dead wrong. He had dealt with much worse than nosy neighbors in his lifetime. Without hesitation, he stood up, stretching his arms as if he hadn't just spent the last 10 minutes staring at her through a camera feed. Then, deliberately casual, he stepped off the porch and started walking toward the fence. He didn't say a word, didn't call out to her. He just moved, slow and steady, like a predator closing in on prey. Karen hesitated. For the first time since this whole mess had started, she seemed unsure. Then, as if realizing that she had pushed just a little too far, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving quickly back toward her house. Jack stopped at the fence, his pulse steady, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. She was escalating. And that meant he had to be ready. The next morning, Jack made a few calls. First to a lawyer he wanted to know exactly what legal grounds he had if he needed to file a restraining order. Then to a construction company he needed his garage fixed, and he needed it done fast. And finally, to a locksmith because if Karen had been sneaking around his property, he wasn't going to risk her finding a way inside his house. By the afternoon, the construction crew had arrived, assessing the damage and laying out a plan for repairs. Jack stayed close, watching them work, making sure there were no more accidents. Every so often, he would glance toward Karen's house, half expecting to see her peeking out from behind the curtains, but she didn't show herself. That didn't mean she was done. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Jack found something new. His truck, which had been parked in the driveway all day, had a long, deliberate scratch running across the driver's side door. The kind of scratch that didn't happen by accident. The kind that was made with intent. Jack stood there for a long moment, staring at the damage, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. This was war. And Karen had just made a very big mistake. Jack had spent the entire morning watching the construction crew work on his garage, his arms crossed over his chest, as they reinforced the remaining structure and replaced the sections that had been deliberately sabotaged. The workers didn't ask many questions, though one of them, an older man with sun-wrinkled skin and a no-nonsense demeanor, muttered that he had seen cases like this before neighbors who didn't respect boundaries. People who thought they could get away with things just because they knew the right people or thought they were untouchable. Jack had simply nodded in agreement, his thoughts too consumed with Karen's latest act of escalation to engage in conversation. The scratch on his truck door was a message, plain and simple. It wasn't just petty vandalism, it was her way of letting him know that she had no intention of backing down, that she wasn't done with him yet. He had taken photos of the damage, filed a police report, and even handed over footage from his security cameras that showed a shadowy figure moving around his driveway in the dead of night. But as expected, the police weren't exactly jumping at the opportunity to do anything about it. The officer who came by had barely hidden his disinterest, shrugging as he said that, without a clear face or solid proof of Karen actually causing the damage, there wasn't much they could do. Could have been kids messing around, he had said, already looking eager to move on to the next call. Jack had clenched his jaw, biting back his frustration. He knew exactly who was responsible, and now he knew he had to change his approach. By midday, after the crew had packed up and left, Jack locked his garage, checked every camera angle, and took a walk around his property to make sure nothing else had been tampered with. As he neared the fence separating his yard from Karen's, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning his head slowly, he saw her standing on her back porch, her arms resting on the railing, watching him with a smug little smile. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Looks like you're making some progress," she called out, her voice light, almost playful. Jack didn't respond. She tilted her head, feigning concern. "You know, these kinds of repairs can get expensive. I really hope you're not struggling. It would be such a shame if you had to sell the place." He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to lash out, to lose his temper so she could paint him as the unstable one. But he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he just smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a cold, knowing one that made her own falter just slightly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. If she wanted to play games, he would play, but on his own terms. That night, Jack made sure every door and window was locked, double-checking the security system before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. His mind was racing, replaying every interaction, every small escalation that had led to this point. He couldn't understand what Karen's end goal was. Did she really believe she could push him into leaving? That he would just pack up and abandon the home he had worked so hard for? Or was this all just some twisted power trip, a way for her to prove to herself that she controlled the neighborhood? Sometime around 3 in the morning, a noise jerked him out of his restless half-sleep. It was faint, barely audible over the steady hum of the night, but distinct enough to set his nerves on edge. A soft metallic clink, followed by the subtle shuffle of movement just outside. Jack sat up, listening intently. Another sound, a quiet creak, like weight shifting against wood. He threw off the covers and moved quickly, silently, grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand as he made his way to the window overlooking the driveway. His pulse pounded in his ears as he peered out through the darkness. And then he saw it. A figure crouched near his garage door, fumbling with something near the handle. The dim glow of the nearby street lamp cast just enough light to illuminate the intruder's silhouette, and even before he saw the glint of blonde hair catching the faint glow, he already knew. Karen. Jack's grip tightened around the flashlight, every muscle in his body tensing. She was trying to break in. For a split second, he considered storming outside, confronting her head-on. But he stopped himself. That was exactly what she wanted. If he caught her in the act, she'd have to come up with some excuse, some ridiculous claim that she was checking on a noise or just passing by. And even if he did call the cops, what were they going to do? Slap her on the wrist and tell her not to do it again? No, he needed to be smart. He reached for his phone, opening the security app and switching to the live camera feed. The motion sensors had already picked up the activity, and now he had a crystal clear recording of her attempting to force the lock on his garage. She was focused, determined, as if she had done this before. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, Jack felt something other than just anger. He felt real, tangible unease. She wasn't just messing with him. She wanted something inside that garage. Jack took another moment to ensure the footage was saved before moving away from the window. He grabbed his car keys, his pulse still hammering as he made his way quietly to the back door. If Karen wanted to see how far she could push him, she was about to find out. Slipping outside, he moved through the shadows, keeping himself out of her line of sight. She was still hunched over the lock, completely unaware that he was closing in. He moved quickly, silently, his steps precise and calculated. By the time she realized he was behind her, it was too late. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen gasped, jerking upright so fast she nearly lost her balance. She spun around, her face a mask of surprise and something else, something that looked an awful lot like frustration. "Jack," she said, her voice just a little too loud, just a little too forced. "Oh my God, you scared me." He didn't lower the flashlight, letting the bright beam hit her directly in the face. "Answer the question." She blinked rapidly, raising a hand to shield her eyes. I heard a noise. I thought maybe someone was trying to break in." Jack stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Funny. That's exactly what I thought." For the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. Her mouth opened, then closed again as she struggled to come up with a response. Jack took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "I have you on camera, Karen, trying to break into my garage. You want to explain that?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her composure slipping just slightly. Then, just as quickly, she straightened, crossing her arms over her chest. "I don't appreciate being accused like this." Jack let out a short, humorless laugh. "You don't appreciate being accused? I don't appreciate you creeping around my property in the middle of the night." She took a deep breath, then let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to help. But if this is how you're going to treat me, maybe I was wrong about you." Jack didn't say a word. He just stared at her, unblinking, until she finally turned and walked away. And as he stood there in the dark, watching her disappear into the night, he realized something. This wasn't just a game to her. She wasn't going to stop. Jack barely slept after catching Karen at his garage. Even though he had clear footage of her attempting to break in, he knew that wasn't going to be enough to stop her. The police had already dismissed his previous complaints, and she was too careful, too calculated in her actions to leave behind any real, undeniable evidence of her wrongdoing. She wasn't just some reckless troublemaker acting on impulse. She was methodical, patient, and disturbingly persistent. This wasn't just about his garage anymore. This was about control. She wanted to prove that she could push him, intimidate him, and ultimately break him. The realization settled in his gut like a stone as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what she might do next. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing outside, watching him, waiting. She was waiting for him to make a mistake, and that meant he couldn't afford to make one. By morning, Jack had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let her dictate his life, wasn't going to let her keep escalating this twisted power struggle. But he also wasn't going to charge into this blindly. Karen wanted a war, but he wasn't about to fight on her terms. The first thing he did was reinforce his security. He installed additional cameras, repositioning some to capture more angles of his property. He upgraded the locks on his house and garage, ensuring that even if she tried again, she wouldn't get far. He documented everything, every strange occurrence, every piece of damage, every time she so much as looked in his direction. He kept records, photos, and timestamps, determined to build an airtight case against her. He knew that if he wanted to get real action taken against her, he needed a mountain of evidence, something that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. That afternoon, he paid a visit to a lawyer. The man was direct, no nonsense, and after hearing Jack's story, he didn't mince words. "She's testing your limits," he said, flipping through Jack's collected evidence. "She wants to see how far she can push you before you either break or retaliate in a way that gives her the upper hand. If she's been doing this to others before you, she knows exactly how to operate in that gray area where the police won't do much unless there's a serious incident." Jack exhaled, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drumming against his knee. "So what do I do?" The lawyer closed the folder and steepled his fingers. "You keep gathering evidence, and you stay calm. The minute you lose your temper, she wins. People like this thrive on playing the victim. But if you document everything and keep things professional, you'll be in a position to hit her with legal action that she won't be able to wiggle out of." Jack left the office feeling more determined than ever. He had been reactive up until now, trying to handle each of Karen's provocations as they came. But that was about to change. He was going to get ahead of her. That night, Jack made sure every entrance to his house and garage was locked, every camera was working, and every motion sensor was armed. He wasn't expecting anything to happen immediately. Karen had just been caught the night before, so she'd likely lay low for a while, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. He was right. The following days were uneventful. Karen didn't approach him, didn't make any snide comments, didn't even acknowledge his existence. If he hadn't known better, he might have thought she had finally given up. But he did know better. This wasn't over. She was just biding her time, waiting for the right opportunity. Then, on the 5th day, he woke up to find his back fence completely destroyed. The wooden panels had been knocked down, some broken into jagged pieces, others missing entirely. It looked like someone had driven a truck straight through it. At first, Jack thought it might have been an accident, maybe a drunk driver or a reckless teenager. But when he stepped outside and surveyed the damage, that theory didn't hold up. There were no tire tracks, no signs of impact from a vehicle. The destruction was too deliberate, too precise. And that wasn't even the worst part. Scrawled across the remaining section of the fence, in large, uneven letters, was a message. "You don't belong here." Jack stood there, his pulse pounding. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. He wasn't about to give Karen the reaction she wanted. As he turned to head back inside, movement caught his eye. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch, sipping from a mug, watching him. And she was smiling. Jack held her gaze for a long moment, then without a word went inside. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. But that didn't mean he wasn't furious. That afternoon, he had the fence repaired and reinforced with metal posts. He upgraded his security system even further, installing floodlights that would illuminate his entire yard if triggered. He also made another call to his lawyer, updating him on the situation. The lawyer advised him to file another police report, not because he expected them to do anything, but because it was important to have a record of every incident. Jack followed that advice. But as expected, when the police arrived, they were dismissive. "Could have been kids," the officer said, barely glancing at the graffiti. "We'll file the report, but unless you saw who did it, there's not much we can do." Jack clenched his jaw but nodded. He knew arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. That night, he barely slept. Not because he was afraid, no, fear wasn't the right word. It was something else. A deep, simmering frustration. A need to put an end to this. He had spent his whole life building something for himself, working hard to create a life where he didn't have to deal with people like Karen, and now she was trying to take that away from him. But she had underestimated him. At 3 in the morning, the motion sensors went off. Jack was already awake when the alert flashed on his phone. He grabbed it, pulling up the security feed. His breath caught in his throat. Karen was in his driveway. But she wasn't alone. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie, stood beside her. They were both near his truck, and he could see the man pulling something from his pocket. A key. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight and his baseball bat, moving quickly and quietly. He wasn't about to let them get away with this. By the time he stepped outside, they had already started working on his truck, trying to get the door open. Jack flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, landing directly on them. Karen flinched, turning toward him with wide, startled eyes. The man beside her froze, his hand still on the truck's handle. Jack didn't say a word. He just stared at them, his expression cold, his grip tightening around the bat. The silence stretched. Then, Karen laughed. It was a soft, breathy sound, completely out of place given the circumstances. "Jack," she purred, tilting her head, "you really should be asleep. You look exhausted." Jack didn't blink. "Get away from my truck," the man finally moved, releasing the handle and stepping back. Karen sighed, rolling her eyes like he was being dramatic. "We were just looking," she said, her voice annoyingly casual. Jack took a step forward. "I won't warn you again," Karen smirked. But there was something else in her expression now, something wary. "Fine. No need to be so aggressive," she turned and walked away. The man following her without a word. Jack watched them until they disappeared into the shadows. Then, slowly, he exhaled. This wasn't just about territory anymore. Karen wasn't just playing games. She was testing how far she could go. And next time she wouldn't stop at just looking. Jack had never been the type to back down from a fight, but this was something different. This wasn't just about standing his ground or refusing to let Karen intimidate him. This was a battle of attrition, a war of psychological endurance, and he was beginning to understand that she thrived on this kind of conflict. The woman was relentless, persistent in a way that made it clear she wasn't just trying to harass him for the sake of it. She wanted him gone, out of the neighborhood, out of the house, away from the garage she seemed to believe belonged to her. And she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. The night after catching her and the unknown man attempting to break into his truck, Jack didn't sleep. He stayed up, watching the security feeds, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, Karen was outside watering her lawn, acting as if nothing had happened. There was no shame, no fear, not even an acknowledgement that she had been caught. If anything, she seemed more amused than anything else. And that told Jack everything he needed to know. She wasn't done, not even close. By the afternoon, Jack noticed something odd. The mail that was supposed to be delivered never arrived. His mailbox, usually filled with the usual junk flyers and bills, was empty. At first he thought maybe the mailman had just been late, but when he went down the street to check, he saw that his neighbors had all received their deliveries. Something wasn't right. He walked back toward his house, glancing toward Karen's property, and then he saw at the corner of a white envelope peeking out from behind her fence. He felt his pulse spike as he stepped closer. The envelope had his name on it, partially torn, as if someone had ripped it open and discarded it in a hurry. She was stealing his mail. Jack clenched his jaw, taking a deep breath to steady himself. This was a federal offense, something that could finally get the authorities to take action. He pulled out his phone, snapped a photo, then walked straight back inside to make a call. When he reached the post office, they confirmed that his mail had, in fact, been delivered that morning. That was all Jack needed to hear. He contacted the police again, filing yet another report, this time for mail theft. He had proof, he had documentation, and this time the officer on the phone actually seemed interested. Tampering with mail is a serious charge, the officer said. We'll send someone by to take a look. For the first time, Jack felt a sense of progress. But deep down, he knew Karen wouldn't take this lightly. She had been escalating every time he pushed back, and now that law enforcement was actually getting involved, He expected her response to be worse than ever. He was right. That night, the power went out. Jack had been in the middle of reviewing security footage when suddenly, his entire house was plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator cut off, the glow of his computer screen vanished, and the cameras he had set up flickered off. He grabbed a flashlight and moved quickly to the breaker box outside, his gut telling him exactly what he was going to find. And sure enough, the main switch had been flipped. Someone had come onto his property and manually shut off the power. He turned it back on and immediately checked the security feeds. But there was nothing. Whoever had done this had known exactly where to avoid the cameras, had moved quickly and efficiently, just enough to remind him that they could reach him anytime they wanted. Karen was getting bolder. Jack knew that at this point he had two options. He could pack up and leave, give her what she wanted, or he could put an end to this himself. And leaving was never an option. The following evening, he prepared. He installed battery backups for the cameras, set up additional motion sensors in the blind spots, and most importantly, he waited. He sat in his darkened living room, his phone in one hand, a baseball bat resting against the couch beside him, listening for the slightest sound. Hours passed, the silence stretching, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. Then, just past 3 a.m, he heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. Jack didn't move. He let them come closer, let them believe they were undetected. Then, as soon as he saw the shadow near his back porch, he flicked on the floodlights. The entire yard was bathed in blinding white light, and there she was. Karen, standing just a few feet from his door, eyes wide with shock. For the first time, she looked genuinely caught off guard. Jack stepped outside, slow and deliberate, not bothering to hide his fury. "What the hell are you doing, Karen?" His voice was calm, controlled, but laced with something dark, something dangerous. Karen blinked rapidly, then quickly recovered, letting out a small, breathy laugh. "Jack, I have you on camera," he interrupted, holding up his phone. "Right now, live feed, you're trespassing." Again. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, but she didn't move. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You don't belong here, Jack." His grip tightened on the phone. "That's not your call to make," she smiled then, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder, something sharper. "You should leave while you still can." Jack exhaled slowly, taking a step forward. "I think we both know that's not going to happen." For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken threats. Then, without another word, Karen turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness like she had never been there at all. Jack didn't sleep the rest of the night. He filed another police report, sent the footage to his lawyer, and doubled down on security. But something told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Karen had pushed him, taunted him, tried to intimidate him, but she hadn't won. And as long as he stayed, she wasn't going to stop. But she had made one mistake. She thought he was like the others. She thought he would break. She was wrong. Jack knew that Karen's threat wasn't just an empty warning. She had spent weeks escalating her harassment, pushing him further and further, testing how much he would tolerate before he either gave in or snapped. But he hadn't broken, hadn't lashed out, hadn't fallen into the trap she had set for him. He had documented everything, played it smart, stayed calm, even when every fiber of his being had wanted to drag her off his property and make her understand that he wasn't someone she could intimidate. But patience had a limit, and after catching her lurking near his back porch in the dead of night, that limit had been reached. He had enough evidence now, enough footage, enough reports, enough proof that she wasn't just an annoying neighbor but a real and active threat. And it was time to put an end to this. The next morning, Jack drove straight to his lawyer's office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had already sent the security footage, had already compiled every report, every police complaint, every incident where Karen had trespassed, vandalized, or stolen from him. But now he needed to know what his options were. The lawyer wasted no time in laying it out. "We can file for a restraining order immediately," he said, flipping through the paperwork. Given the evidence, there's a strong case for it being granted. It won't stop her from being your neighbor, but it will legally prevent her from coming anywhere near your property. If she violates it, she'll be arrested on the spot." Jack exhaled slowly, nodding. "And the criminal charges?" The lawyer tapped a pen against the desk. "That's the tricky part. The police reports help, but so far nothing she's done has been violent or extreme enough for immediate legal action beyond property damage and trespassing. The mail theft is the strongest charge, but we need more pressure. The good news is, once a restraining order is in place, she's walking on thin ice. People like her don't know when to stop. The moment she tries anything again, she'll be digging her own grave." That was exactly what Jack was counting on. The process moved quickly. Within days, the restraining order was in effect, officially barring Karen from coming within a certain distance of Jack's property. She received the notice in the mail, and Jack knew the moment she opened it. He had been working in his garage when he heard the sound of something heavy slamming against her wall. Then, seconds later, the sharp screech of her front door being thrown open. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her as she stormed outside, gripping the letter in her shaking hands. She was seething, her face red with fury, her breathing uneven. For the first time since this entire nightmare had started, Karen looked genuinely unhinged, but she didn't cross the line. Not yet. She just stood there, fists clenched, teeth grinding together, staring at him as if willing him to react. Jack simply wiped his hands on a rag, closed his toolbox, and walked back into his house without giving her a single glance. He had won this round, and she knew it. But he also knew that Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. For 3 days there was silence. No trespassing, no taunts, no games. Jack almost allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized she had lost. But on the 4th night, just past 2 in the morning, his motion sensors went off. He woke instantly, his pulse steady, his instincts already screaming that this was it. The moment she would push too far, he checked the camera feed, his breath slow and controlled, and there she was. Karen was standing at the edge of his property, just beyond the invisible boundary set by the restraining order. She wasn't moving, wasn't trying to sneak onto his land, just standing there, staring at his house. In her hands, she held something. A box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. Jack frowned, adjusting the camera angle, trying to see what she was doing. Then, without warning, she bent down and carefully placed the box at the base of his mailbox before straightening and walking away without a single glance back. Jack didn't move for a long moment. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust her. Every instinct told him that whatever was in that box, it wasn't good. But he also knew he needed proof. He grabbed his phone, took screenshots from the footage, then called the police. He didn't go outside. He didn't touch the package. He waited. When the officers arrived 20 minutes later, they took one look at the footage and immediately approached the mailbox with caution. One of them knelt down, examining the package before carefully peeling away the paper. Jack watched from his porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable as they opened the box. Then, without warning, one of the officers let out a sharp curse. Inside the box was a collection of Jack's belongings, items that had gone missing over the past few weeks. His missing wrench set, his spare house key, a few personal documents that had been stored in his filing cabinet. All of it neatly packed together like a twisted gift. And on top of it all, a single note written in Karen's precise, looping handwriting. "I told you this place didn't belong to you." That was it. That was the final nail in the coffin. The officers didn't hesitate. Within the hour, Karen was in handcuffs, screaming about how this was all some big misunderstanding, how Jack was the real villain, how she was being set up. But none of it mattered. The evidence was overwhelming, the restraining order had been violated, and she had practically handed the police everything they needed to charge her. Jack watched from his porch as they put her in the back of the squad car, her face twisted in fury, her voice hoarse from shouting. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally breathe again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed to exhale with relief. A few neighbors even came by to quietly admit that they had also dealt with Karen's manipulations, her subtle threats, her obsessive need for control. She had terrorized people for years, but no one had ever been able to do anything about it. Until now. Jack took his time repairing the last of the damage she had caused. The fence, the garage, the mailbox. He didn't rush, didn't let the lingering tension get to him. He knew Karen wasn't coming back. She was facing multiple charges now, and even if she somehow managed to avoid jail time, there was no way she'd be allowed to stay in the neighborhood after this. Her reign was over. One afternoon, as he stood in his driveway, polishing the hood of his favorite car, he noticed something. A for sale sign had been planted in Karen's yard. The house was already being cleared out, movers hauling away boxes, the remnants of a life built on manipulation and control packed away into cardboard. Jack simply smirked, wiped down the last of the dust from his car, and went back to his work. It was over, and he had won.